In this session, we'll be talking about JMeter's logic controllers. As we mentioned in the previous article, they'll help us add structure and flow management to our scripts. There are many types of controllers available in JMeter, but we will be focusing on the ones we think are most widely used. You'll be able to find more information on all of them on JMeter's user's manual if you're interested. Let's start with a simple controller. We use these controllers to organize our scripts. We'll want all HTTP samplers that belong to the same user action to be grouped, and for that we will use a simple controller. We could, for example, have one controller called loadPage, where we will put the corresponding HTTP request. Another controller which we have already seen in previous lessons is a recording controller. It is the default element in which the proxy server will store the recorded samples. However, it is important to know that it's not the only controller in which we can record. If we have a look at the target controller options, we can see that we can select the simple controller we have added before, so we don't necessarily need to use the recording controller to capture samples. Let's now have a look at the once-only controller. All of the actions that are inside it will be processed only once per thread and ignored in following iterations. We normally use a once-only controller when we have to test a site that requires a login, since we don't need the virtual user to log into the site on each iteration. Doing it once will be enough to establish a user session. Let's now talk about the transaction controllers. We use a transaction controller when we want to know the overall time taken to process all the samples that are inside it. It generates an additional sample that measures this time. By default, this additional sample will be added after all the nested samples, but if we select this option, it will be generated as a parent of the other samples. If we select this other option, the pre- and post-processing delays will be taken into account in the measured time as well. As an example, let's add a transaction controller that includes all the requests generated when searching for an item in the OpenCart site. I'll just copy the requests from one of our previous scripts. You can see them both here. Let's add a listener so we can view the results. We will disable all the previous controllers so we only run the search. And let's run the test. If we have a look at the sample response from the transaction controller, we can see here the total time taken to process all the requests that were inside the controller. We can observe that it is the sum of the individual load times. Let's now have a look at the if controller. We use the if controller when we need to execute HTTP requests based on a specific condition. It allows us to control whether the test elements below it are run or not. Here, we will enter the condition, which is interpreted as a JavaScript code that returns true or false. For example, we can validate if my variable equals hello. If this option is selected, then the condition must be an expression that evaluates to true. If this other option is selected, then the condition will be evaluated for all children. Otherwise, it will be only evaluated on entry. Another widely used controller is the loop controller. JMeter will repeat the actions we place inside it a certain number of times. Here is where we'll define the number of iterations. As an example, let's add inside the controller the action add an item to the cart. And if here we set 5, when we run the test, it will add 5 items to our shopping cart. Another controller that is used to run loops is the while controller. It iterates through its children until the condition we set here equals false. If the condition is left blank or says last, it will exit the loop when the last sample in the loop fails. Lastly, we're going to mention the for each controller. This controller loops through the values of a set of related input variables which share a prefix, for example input, and are followed by an index. Optionally, we can indicate the start and end index that should be taken into account. So the input will be several variables, each of which must have a value, and in each iteration the output variable will take a new value from the inputs following the indexes. We will name our output variable output. So to see how it works, let's define 3 input variables. For this we will use the element user-defined variables. The prefix we defined before was input, and we're going to use the indexes 1 to 3. We will set them the following values: 10, 20, and 30. As we have created 3 variables, the for each controller will run 3 iterations. Let's add a debug sampler so we can see the results, and we will run a test. We can see that for each of the samplers, the value of the output variable changes. Each time it takes a different value from the input. So now you have learned how to work with the most used controllers in JMeter.